Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyun Park from Amalgam Insights here with Charlie Araujo, as always. How are you, Charlie?
I am good. I'm running on fumes. It is Magic Quadrant season, and so we are going through all of those hits. And then, of course, we had an end of quarter, so we had our big review. And I mean, that was actually a month ago, but took a while, and it's been busy. I'm just like sort of just running on adrenaline right now. So hopefully, I don't look it too bad. But otherwise, I'm doing great. How about you?
Yeah, so I'm still job searching, of course. It is likely based on the jobs that I'm looking at that I will be in a situation similar to yours in the next 6 to 12 months, looking at quadrants and market scopes, marketscapes, and landscapes, and trying to get our company listed. So I'm looking forward to seeing what this looks like on the other side of the fence after having been the bully for 15 years or so and sending out these RFPs and questionnaires and briefing requests and all of that nonsense.
Even having been on both sides of it, it is sort of a brutal process. I've always been sort of critical to big analyst firms and in terms of all of it. Although I will say, in fairness, I actually have gotten both some value out of going through the MQ process, mostly because it forced me to really take a hard look at our strategy and being the person that owns all of that. I was answering, and it's like I sort of had two choices: do I go and sort of do the boilerplate and give them the answers they want, or am I going to take a really hard look at all of this? And I chose the hard look, which has left me more tired, but I think better for the
Mhm.
effort. And actually had a really good inquiry with a Gartner analyst, which not to be totally down about it, but it's sort of surprising for me. And so it's been actually a good experience. But I'll send you a box of toothpicks. It's helpful to keep your eyes open when you're running on fumes. So.
Yeah, one last analyst relations note there. I think it's actually really useful to look at these questionnaires and get a big picture view of how each analyst firm looks at your market, because that can be really enlightening, actually, both to see what you're taking for granted and then perhaps to see what pieces of the puzzle you might be ignoring because you get deep into your own solution. I do remember being on the vendor side, and you think 100% about your product, how to make your product better, how to make your customers more successful. But there's this whole outside world out there, and often there's big picture trends that you just miss because you're so busy trying to close the next deal, make the next $1 million. So it's always helpful to get that outside perspective, even if the actual process might be a bit painful.
Well, that's always the value. That's always been the value of analysts is that they bring this outside perspective. I think the thing that even being an analyst, because I had spent my career, on the buyer side and then as the analyst and thought leader, blah blah blah, but not really on the software side. And I think the part that I didn't fully appreciate is how easy it is to get sucked into the internal vortex of all of the stuff where it's like you have to really claw your way out so you can like look at the outside world and not lose sight of what you're actually trying to doing. And that's where I think the analyst community has always been a great help. So anyway, with all of that said, lots of news, busy week. We're gonna have trouble getting through all of it. And I think we have to start with the big news that took a year to unfold. We actually just watched the video segment from a year ago when we were sure that the Informatica acquisition by Salesforce was about to happen. It was rumored and then apparently it fell apart. And then, sort of out of the blue, this time the news cycle lasted like 2 whole days.
Yes.
And it closed, and now suddenly Informatica is owned by Salesforce. And and I think I look back and watch the video, and I certainly have sort of a different perspective on it now, maybe a different appreciation for it. So I'll let you cue it up and kind of give your thoughts on what you think what you think of it, and has your opinion changed in the last year?
Yeah, at a big picture level, the Salesforce has announced its intention to acquire Informatica. It's going to be an $8 billion acquisition. And from a high level perspective, this makes sense because Informatica has been mostly PE owned, private equity owned. For a while, they're also publicly traded, but there was a big stake owned by Permira Partners, as well as the Canadian Pension Fund. and they have gotten their money back, but obviously they have been owning their stake for about 10 years now, and that's usually a good time frame for entering and exiting a private investment. So it's good timing from that perspective. But also it's a good move because, as we've discussed before, Salesforce has become a data company. Their platform is extremely important to them. Their ability to work with other solutions is important. And with Agentforce, they are making a play to become an enterprise-wide technology play, which requires access to data. So I think a lot of these things make sense at a high level. They made sense a year ago, and they still make sense now. I'm curious to see where
Yeah, I
your
think
changed.
Yeah, well, I think it changed a little bit insofar as the world of AI has changed. I mean, if you go back a year ago, we didn't really have Agentforce, right? And so
Right.
from a pure data standpoint, it was a little less obvious. I think what is interesting is from an AI perspective, we've talked about AI is, and we actually talked about it during the show, but we talked about it from the context of digital transformation and in the early stages, it was all about process and data. And I think that is even more true now. And I think one of the more interesting analyses is a woman who I don't know, Prukalpa, co-founder of a data company called Atlan, and she wrote this interesting sort of analysis. And what she pointed out was that in the news around all of this, that there was very little talk about data integration, which of course we all think of the bread and butter of what Informatica is all about, and that instead it was all about metadata and governance. And I think that was very enlightening and very insightful in terms of what this is really all about. That as we see Salesforce, ServiceNow, and some of these others really sort of start battling out on the agentic AI front, understanding that data is the underlying component, that it really is going to come down to this idea of governance, metadata, lineage, of being able to validate the veracity of the data, because you now have agents that are attempting to work autonomously on top of it. And if you can't control that scope, then you have unpredictability with it. So I thought that was interesting. Again, it speaks to the one thing that I question. In fact, she has a horse in this fight with the company called Atlan, but I think she makes a very strong point. Certainly, a point that we at Symphony are making to a certain extent in a different dimension. But this idea that as Salesforce and ServiceNow and some of the others, SAP, are trying to build this sort of end-to-end monolithic view of all of this, that it's sort of they're betting that someone's going to invest and effectively put all their eggs in their basket, right? And I think that there is a heck of a case to be made at certain levels where that you want a degree of independence, that you want a degree of agnosticism, so that you're not having all those eggs in one basket. And the reality is, I don't think any organization is ever going to be fully invested where everything is in a single platform, at least not in a major one. And so I thought it's interesting sort of on both fronts. And there's one other interesting aspect to it, which I'll get to in a second. But I mean, what is your take on that? I mean, so that's why I'm sort of probably more positive on it, because that makes a lot more sense to me. Does that ring true with sort of how you're seeing it?
Yeah, a year ago, basically, when we looked at bringing outside data into models and AI, we basically had retrieval augmented generation, but we didn't have some of these newer things about model context protocol, agent to agent, the entire area of agent orchestration that has shown up over the past year. A lot of things just weren't there last year. And even so, it made some sense to go in this direction. But I also think it's interesting that increasingly we're seeing Salesforce being bifurcated to some degree. You've got the sales, service, and marketing stuff that is really like core Salesforce applications. And now we have, call it Tableau and Slack and Informatica, which are, I would say, more vendor neutral.
And MuleSoft?
Uh, MuleSoft to some extent, but I think MuleSoft has been pulled a little bit more into Salesforce over time, and honestly, kind of deprecated. It's getting a little long in the tooth, which is part of why the Informatica acquisition also made sense. There's obviously overlap in the integration space between MuleSoft and Informatica. But even when I've been at Dreamforce or Trailblazer events over the past year, I've definitely seen how MuleSoft is kind of being treated as this legacy product. And if you want to do the cool stuff, you should really adopt Agentforce or use some of the cooler Slack-based or action-based activities. So that's part of the reason they needed Informatica as well. They needed just a newer, more updated product.
Well, so my last two observations around this is when I watched back our video from a year ago, and my core point, which is my core point still holds true, in that I remain concerned that Salesforce is becoming too big, too diverse, it's getting tougher and tougher to get that sort of consolidated vision, all of Benioff's efforts to the contrary notwithstanding, to really understand, like almost like what you're saying, right? All these different moving parts and pieces. And that I think that is going to become challenging. And I listened to a great podcast that I listened to called Lenny's something, but where they talk about product managers, and one of them was a startup. It was a product manager, the chief product officer for a startup, and one of their claim to fame is just this ability to kind of be lean and mean and fast. And what's interesting about it is that Salesforce and arguably ServiceNow are following in the very long tradition of these very large companies that, in order to keep growing, in order to keep hitting their numbers, they just have to keep acquiring, and they end up just becoming sort of it's bloat, right? And they're definitely providing value within the enterprise, but it just gets harder and harder to be able to say, hey, this is this compelling vision, and to get that sort of startup mentality. My last little observation, though, was the relative value degradation, I guess is what I'd say, of Informatica. I mean, this is a 5x multiple from their revenue to acquisition. And I compare it to, say, ServiceNow's recent acquisition of MoveWorks, which was a 25 times multiple. And I find that fascinating, right? Ostensibly because if I had to pick and choose here in terms of what has a greater long-term value, I would think something like Informatica really does. It's a much more core piece of technology. But I do find it interesting where how companies are being valued right now in this age of AI, that if you're a core AI player, your valuation is significantly higher.
Right. And Informatica is definitely the stickier of the and more infrastructure vital of those two companies. I totally agree there. But I think the margins involved and the financial modeling involved make that more difficult. Without going into detail, I had a client last year looking at Informatica, and they thought that the real price of the Informatica stock was around this mid 20s range, which is what the sale price ended up being. And it spent a lot of time, call it around 16, 17, or 18. So this investor thought, it doesn't matter that the numbers I'm telling you the numbers, because without the details, like, the numbers don't mean anything. But but fundamentally, that the stock was underpriced by a whole bunch based on the stability of the company and the actual revenues that were involved. So this seems to be a fair outcome, but it does seem that Informatica might have missed a chance to get a bigger outcome, as we were talking about an $11 billion purchase last year, and this ended up being an $8 billion price, which was the fair neutral price. I think Benioff got a great deal for what it's worth for what this is. And I also think this is interesting because Informatica has a significant footprint in India. So this now increases Salesforce's workforce and executive footprint in India, which is obviously a huge and important strategic market right now in this US-China political detente, where India seems to be kind of the third party neutral player in the middle.
Yeah, absolutely. So no, I think overall this is probably good for both. We'll see how this shakes out. I think it will be. I mean, I think that for Informatica, it could have gone a lot of ways. I think this is probably one of the better. If they were going to end up in acquisition, this was probably one of the better landing places for them. Other big news: the week, of course, was Google I/O's conference. where no surprise to anybody, it was wall-to-wall AI. And as usual with these, they just like turn on a fire hose of announcements. So well over 100 announcements. Uh, Go ahead, take us through what you thought was noteworthy, if anything, from Google I/O.
I thought that this was actually a pretty good show for Google for what it's worth. I think they brought out a lot of models that looked really interesting and can fit into workflows. And they brought out, of course, their mega Gemini subscription, which is $250 a month, but also it includes access to a bunch of these new models that go across coding and content and video and writing and doing all sorts of different automated things that could possibly be worth it if you think of Gemini as an automation platform rather than simply as a set of AI models, which is, I think, the mistake that OpenAI made. OpenAI sold this $200 thing, and all you got was access to a cool model, whereas Gemini is providing access to a bunch of models and tools. But I think what really got my attention is they announced a couple of overriding workspace capabilities that work on top of these models. One's called Firebase Studio, which is basically their IDE, their software workspace to be able to work with a bunch of their models and their code assistants within this bigger picture studio. And then there's also the Flow capability, which brings in their VO3 video model, as well as some of their pictures and other capabilities, and provides, again, a kind of a studio capability, but for movies and pictures. And I think it's interesting to see Google taking that next level view of AI rather than simply providing the constituent little bits and pieces.
So I think what struck me the most from the announcements was the effectively complete lack of anything focused on the enterprise or B2B motions. And what I think is, I mean, and maybe we're going to see that. I mean, this is, in fairness, I guess, more of their, I guess, consumer-ish facing piece, right? This isn't but I mean, I feel like the challenge that Google has right now is they sort of are trying to be everything to everybody and are, to me, they should be really looking at how they compete with Microsoft and AWS and carving that out. And they delivered a whole bunch of stuff that is interesting in some cases, but um, and certainly at a foundation level, but just sort of really like I was kind of scratching my head. It's like, well, where is the piece here that's going to make this relevant from the businesses that are actually putting AI to use within their organizations to try to make sense of it? So that was probably my big takeaway in looking at it. I thought there was some cool stuff. I think they have got some really cool technology. I think that they're catching up on that front in general if I compare it to OpenAI. They have continued. I love one commentator talked about how they've continued their long history of giving projects names that have absolutely nothing to do with what the project's about. So they introduced Project Mariner, which whatever. That probably the other thing I do think is interesting is I feel like they finally saw the light and recognized that searches in the traditional Google mechanism has come to an end or will be coming to an end, and they finally seem to be really embracing AI powered search. And perhaps confusingly, they introduced like 3 different ways that you can have AI powered search.
Yes.
Which which is a little bit, I think, frustrating or challenging, insofar as it gets confusing. But yeah, I mean, it was. I probably wasn't quite as taken. I mean, I think, well, you were taken by the technology. The technology is cool. I mean, the technology, the VO in particular, was like pretty awestrucking. I mean, it was like, wow, that's pretty amazing. So I guess from a raw technology standpoint, but I feel like maybe this is what I'm rambling on about, is that I feel like Google's always been good at producing the technology, but what I think they're still struggling with is marketability and how they're going to actually deliver this into a production state.
Yeah, I worry that this is a bunch of Google Readers. So I still lament the loss of Google Reader, which I think was a fantastic product, but because Google couldn't figure out how to get 1 billion people to use it and pay $10 a month, they killed it off. And it's so frustrating for me to see, because to me that was a way to be able to create a larger ecosystem of content. And okay, I can go on about Google Reader, but the bigger point here is that are a bunch of these AI tools similar, that we're going to be able to create these amazing 8-second videos and do these great workflow automation tasks. And then one day, 5 years from now, it's all going to be taken away because these are all consumer betas at the end of the day. Google still has yet to answer this question. And like you said, Charlie, this is there's no real enterprise play here. This is really pushing against OpenAI and Perplexity and all the consumer content and apps.
Well, and I think, this entire sort of moonshot mentality, which made a lot of sense for a long time, right? Because they were in a very enviable position in that they were making so much money off a business that effectively ran on autopilot, that they had this latitude. And had any of those really hit, I think then it's like, well, that buys you the right to keep doing it. The challenge is that they really haven't, right? I mean, they still make the bulk of their money off of search, and that is now under very direct threat. And so you do question, it's like, did they somehow get out of sync where they aren't really being very focused? And I look, and maybe I'm reading this wrong, right? I have enterprise lenses on, so maybe if that they're targeting the right group, that it's OpenAI that they should be going after because that's where the future is. I don't know if I buy that, but that seems to be where they're placing their bets, which I think is interesting because of course, OpenAI is not sitting around doing nothing. They made news of their own, talk about a shocking valuation, where they announced the acquisition of Jony Ive's AI device startup called IO, I think, for $6.4 billion, which, as far as I can tell, they don't have a product yet.
Yes.
All stock, so it's not cash. And in fairness, OpenAI already owned 23% of the company going into it, so it was only an additional $5 billion in stock. But more than anything, it's fascinating and intriguing because it clearly signals a move into consumer-oriented products, AI-driven products, and nobody knows what the heck this is. The rumors are it's going to be an iPod shuffle-sized device that you might wear, and that would be always on AI, which is like, we've heard this before. But of course, it's Jony Ive, and who is, of course, the famous chief designer for Apple for decades and responsible for almost all of their greatest hits. And so you really don't want to discount that, but it's like you're still sitting here going, is it really going to be something that makes sense? And so it's really sort of fascinating to see these two kind of going at it at this level.
Yeah, this probably is not fair to Jony Ive, but anytime I think of rich people giving other rich people money for a company that has no product, I think Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes. Like, it's the first thing that comes to mind. And right now, giving $6 billion, even in stock, to a person or a company that has not actually launched anything. Like, I feel like the last time we saw a lot of hype for a device that didn't actually that was supposed to change the world in this kind of way. Oh gosh, what was it called? That
The
thing
humane.
that vehicle that you
the
push
Segway.
back, the Segway, right? The Segway
Yeah.
was supposed to transform cities. It was unannounced. We didn't see it beforehand. All we saw was the hype and hundreds of millions of dollars being poured into it, and it ended up being an interesting tool for the mall.
And there's another one. Remember that VR company that had the goggles that was supposed to change everything? They
Like
had those
Magic
big
Leap, they got
Magic
$1
Leap, and
billion. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch of these, and the thing that is, to me, really challenging about this is there's no real proof of concept that shows that there's even a market here, because everyone's still, unless, I mean, this is going to be something that's going to literally have to break the paradigm and be a phone replacement. And that's a massive stretch to figure out
Yeah.
what that would actually look like. So I think it's going to be very interesting. I mean, my first reaction when I saw this was that this was like the world's most expensive acquihire. And while this would be ridiculously expensive, it would at least make some sense because he's Jony Ive, right? It makes, like, you can see where that could maybe be worth it. but he's not even he's going to take over like creative control or something, but he still has his independent company, which is always separate from IO, and
Mm-hmm.
he's not leaving that. So this isn't even an acquihire. So it's I have no idea. I guess, this is one we'll definitely be waiting to see what this bears, what fruit it bears. But
Yeah,
it's a big nut to crack.
yeah, OpenAI is trying to prove that it is creating an AI ecosystem that goes everywhere from devices to the data centers where they're getting all that money from SoftBank. And then on the other side, I think with Jony Ive, he's very famous for skeuomorphism and human-based interfaces. So that'll be an interesting piece of the puzzle as well. Oh gosh, there's one more thing. I do think that when we talk about these viral devices and systems and solutions, we tend to ignore the prior art that led to that. Because even with GPT, yes, GPT had its moment where it got 100 million users in a few weeks, but that was GPT-3. Like there was a GPT-2, there was a GPT-1. There were several years of models that led up to this GPT-3 that took the world by storm. And even with the iPhone, like the first year of iPhone, it was an underpowered mobile device. It didn't have apps yet. Like there were all sorts of things that were not great about the first version of the iPhone. And it took a couple of years for the iPhone to become the absolute world killing device that it became. Like everything takes a couple of years in real life to go from proof of concept to even to massive virality.
Yeah, and look, I'll be the first to say that there's unquestionably an opportunity to reimagine and re-envision what the human to technology interface is going to look like, and I don't for one believe that it's going to continue to be a phone forever. The question is, are we really there yet? There's a kind of a stupid show. I think it's on Amazon Prime called Download,
Mm-hmm.
and it's all about these like virtual reality that when you don't die you get downloaded into whatever, but for that part isn't the point. Is that in the show, phones are gone and you wear this little wristband, and with this wristband you flick your hand like this or like this, I think it's like this, and
Mm-hmm.
you get like a virtual phone that pops up and you get a little screen and you can talk with it and you can interact with it, and it's all like a hologram-y thing. And I could see that that is at least an example of someone futuristically thinking about what would the next interface look like. And so I fully expect that there's going to be something. It's going to be something in our lifetimes. I think it's going to be sooner rather than later. But is this it? And is that worth a $6.5 billion bet? I guess we'll see. Maybe, I mean, they know what's on the drawing board. Maybe it is truly earth shattering. Who knows?
Sure. And at the end of the day, I guess $6 billion is only 2% of OpenAI's current valuation. So I guess it's just a rounding
And
error.
and that's the part that worries me, is that they have so much of all of that and they're raising so much money that they're making that this represents just a bad call, because it's no longer meaningful in that way. So what is interesting, that speaks to the fact that OpenAI is unquestionably playing long ball. They're playing big ball here, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then the question though is that in fact that's the bet they're making? And there's been a couple of interesting moves that you brought up from an article standpoint that is sort of pointing to, well, maybe the actual pathway to the future is the opposite, not going big, but instead going small. And I'll cue this up for you. You pointed out two different articles, wildly different, but both sort of pointing the same direction. The first is NVIDIA kind of quietly actually announced a much less expensive Blackwell chip,
Mm-hmm.
mostly trying to get around export curves, but I think also leaning into this idea that organizations are trying to find more cost-effective ways to operationalize all this technology. And then another article in the Register talking about something we talked about over a year ago, and this is this idea of models using the mixture of experts strategy and approach to try to get more efficient models, particularly in inference, right, and not
Yes.
during training. And both of these are sort of pointing to the same lines of like what DeepSeek represented. This idea, of course, they were on the training side mostly, but focusing on how you can do more with less and actually start reducing the cost, which I think everyone agrees is going to be really critical to the operationalization of all of these AI technologies. And so it is interesting to see Google I/O and OpenAI making this acquisition, both companies clearly sticking to the big swing sort of approach,
Mhm.
and then these conversations that are kind of saying, hey, what does this other option look like? So, I mean, how did you read those two articles?
Yeah, there's been so much focus, obviously, starting with OpenAI saying that bigger is better. The end. We need to pour more data into the models. We need to get the models as big as possible, and then we need to put them in the biggest computing areas that are possible. And then that is the way that we are going to create these trillion-dollar companies or whatever. But there's another school of thought saying that AI is actually better when it's constrained, when you're creating limits, when you have specific goals that you are focused on. And that's part of what DeepSeek was based on, that China did not have the latest and greatest NVIDIA chips on hand. So they had to find more efficient ways of being able to test and create models, which led to DeepSeek and then the quick follow-ups by the likes of Alibaba Quen, and then leading to us in America also following suit from an open source perspective. And that is probably going to be an important piece of the puzzle, that China has figured out how to do AI research without necessarily having the fastest chips, because they are able to do more work at the, call it, assembly language level, the the CUJA level of NVIDIA. So they're going to be doing more work there. And now with this new chip that NVIDIA is bringing out for China, yes, it gets around some of the import export issues that they're running into with the United States from a tariff perspective. That limits the level of power that they can export to other companies, but it also probably builds into a Chinese R&D method that we don't necessarily have as much here in the United States, where they can use these lower power chips in bulk and under those compute constraints, create some new AI capabilities that are going to end up surprising us. They're going to find more efficient models and more efficient techniques over time, simply because they are resource constrained, and that actually leads them to be able to do some interesting things from an AI perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a school of thought right now that abundance is actually potentially working against the at least U.S. interests when it
Mhm.
comes to the development of AI, because there's so much money and so much compute and all of this. What I do think is interesting is I think this movement towards smaller, more purpose-built and tailored solutions, I think, is gaining a lot of quiet ground. It doesn't get the news. I mean, both these articles, like neither of these crossed my path, right? I missed them. They're not getting anywhere near the same splash, right, from a news standpoint. But like Microsoft, I think it has in their library now has over 100 small language models
Mhm.
for enterprises to pick and choose from to try to build against specific apps. And I think that we're going to see more and more of this, where that just becomes, I think, the default. Um,
Right.
so yeah,
And from a
it's
practical perspective, the register article we talked about, where AI models are evolving, it brings up the idea of mixture of expert models, which we've talked about before on this show. And the idea that although these mixture of expert models may also have billions and billions of parameters, they are actually segmented internally, so that you may only have to tag, call it, two or three out of 15 different regions to get a certain answer. And those answers may actually be better at the end of the day than the one uniform, gigantic 300 billion or trillion parameter model that might exist from a general perspective. But part of the challenge is those models are probably cheaper to train and maintain over time, and it's not as sexy to talk about, call it, a $500,000 project as much as a $50 million project, even if the $500,000 project gives you more value at the end of the day.
I think it's the traditional hype cycle. I think we're going to find a lot of the value happens at this under the radar sort of level, and I think that's going to be the sign that we're finally hitting mainstream with all of this. So, in the end, I think it's good. What is not so good? Well, we're going to do a couple of news roundups here before we kind of end on a interesting tale from a CIO perspective, then of course end on our fun, quirky stories. We have 2 of them this week. But news roundup, this is a quick hit just because all we can do is sort of shake our head at this, but there's a report coming out of also the Register that a European, the European Cloud Competition Observatory, which is an independent, I think like an NGO type body, did analysis and is saying that VMware's prices under Broadview have risen by 800 to 1,500%, 8 to 15 time increases in price. And what's interesting is not just, this isn't flat out just like incrementing the price, but it's this restructuring how they're approaching it, eliminating pay-as-you-go models, requiring 3-year contracts, all these different sort of, I would argue, almost sleight of hand sort of functions to get these prices up. And that's mind-blowing. I mean, that is, I mean, I think far surpasses anything I was expecting them to do. I mean, we talked about this was where this was going, but come on, it's like, wow.
Yeah, bravo, Broadcom, bravo. Just amazing work there. My MBA brain is just in awe of anybody who can increase prices 10x and keep their client. Like that's amazing work from a business perspective.
I know that's sort of like saying you did an amazing job keeping that woman there, except that you ever tied up in the basement. I don't know. I mean, this is
Yes, you kept your clients hostage and got every dollar that you could out of them. That's good job. It's like I wouldn't have been able to keep a straight face and do that, but
well,
hey.
that's the thing. Having the straight face, what I think is interesting is I think it's going to enter in a absolute gold rush of modernization as organizations are going to. It's going to be the driving force that pushes them into finding other solutions. So I think it's going to be short lived, but I guess you
And
could say
the EU
congratulations.
does not like that kind of extortionate monopoly pricing. There's always going to be a response.
I will be curious to see if they counter it because this is a brand new report just came out a few days ago. I'll be very curious to see if Broadview just sort of like, does that sly little grin like, "Whoops, you caught us," or if they're going to try to refute it. So I guess we'll have to
It's
keep our eye out for
market
that.
pricing, like they say on the menus when you order lobster. Market price.
Yeah, buyer beware. Except this is like the fact that I subscribed to my lobster subscription 4 years ago, and I'm still being charged for it, and you're just jacking it up. I don't know. Okay. Other industry news, and I'll let you cue this one up because this is much more your space. But a company that I haven't heard of called Calero appointed a new chief revenue officer, Eric Martorano. So
Martorano. Yeah.
why are we talking about this one?
So a couple of reasons. First of all, Calero is the market leader in technology expense management, managing well over $15 billion in annual spend, specifically in the communication space. And they are going after the SaaS market as well. And in doing so, they've hired this guy, Eric, who has a deep executive background at Microsoft and other large organizations, managing their channel sales and managing their channel and ecosystem experiences. So I think there's a massive opportunity to be able to look at technology, inventories, and activity. Actually, going back to the AI discussion, figuring out where are all the servers? How are all the networks being managed? How does all this traffic get managed? And how is this going to change now that we are going to 5x or 10x some of our infrastructure investments? I think it's going to be necessary for companies to look at this infrastructure management layer to a greater extent as just part of the nuts and bolts total cost of ownership. But I also think there's this opportunity to think about this matchup of talent in company, because Eric Martorano has this executive background. He's coming to a company that is about 1,000 employees and needs that next level of enterprise maturity. And I think that's an interesting perspective when you think about the current tech environment, where frankly, there's a lot of layoffs happening at large software companies and large tech companies, and even to some extent in IT departments. But there's still this actually big need at the mid-market level for organizations that want to compete with enterprises and are trying to figure out what to do next. They need to bring in, I wouldn't quite call it adult supervision, but at least somebody who understands what that next level of growth looks like to become a, call it 1,000 to 5,000 person company instead of a 500 to 1,000 person company. So I think this is also represents kind of an opportunity for people who are looking at that next stage of their career or trying to figure out what to do next, and saying, hey, there are these opportunities out there. You're just going to have to start looking at companies that may not have been quite on your radar. Kind of Calero, like Calero is not on your radar, Charlie. Like, it is what it is.
Yeah, no, I think it is interesting. I think it's one of the things that I mentioned this podcast I've been listening to, and it was one of them that I found very insightful was this product manager or chief product officer who had crossed everything from like our traditional space of B2B enterprise tech to developer tools to consumer product. I mean, just this huge swath. And the point that he was making was that it was actually an asset to him, that as he dug deep into all these areas, he found nuggets that were transferable into other areas. And I think we're going to see that more and more. And I think AI has an interesting impact in that it's sort of this normalizing layer, right? Where it starts to allow you to sidestep some of the need for domain expertise. That's not really right exactly, but it just it gives you an avenue, I think, to cross bridges and to go different directions. And so I think it's interesting to see how this plays out, and I think what that means from an overall staffing perspective. Which leads us to the next story that I found absolutely fascinating that you brought up. This one's from the New York Times. Um, and basically a little bit of an expose. Everyone's favorite target these days is Amazon. And there's been obviously a lot of talk about the way they've treated their factory workers and all the automation. But this article is talking about how coders are they in fact the next warehouse workers for Amazon, where the work of coding, which has always been, half art, half science, is now being reduced to all science or all maybe not even science anymore, right? But the use of AI coding tools basically is turning the act of development into one that, at least depending on your perspective, is much more automated, routine, less art, less creativity. And really, I think the relevance here is, if you're a CIO, is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is this this fundamentally is about the democratization of development, something that many enterprises have almost moved away from doing development. And so what does this mean? And I'm curious, you brought this article up, how you see this. I mean, which way are you landing on this one?
Yeah, it's been no secret that in the past, that modern coding is a combination of Lego blocks and strategy, where a lot of what you're doing in coding is actually pulling code off of existing libraries or existing repositories to do what you need, rather than trying to write code from scratch. That's just the reality of the job nowadays, and that's getting increasingly easy with the likes of AI. And I think this is a fundamental change again in the nature of work, that we now have different units that are, call it one level up from what we're used to thinking about as the fundamental building blocks of work, and coders are no exception. I see this as just being one piece of that larger trend that is happening in terms of digital white collar work. We have to stop thinking about simply looking at data at the most granular level or code at the most granular level and thinking that is the job. Because if you think that is the job, it's being automated. That is now calculator work at the end of the day. And your job is to figure out how to work the calculator, not to imitate the calculator.
Well, what I think is interesting from a couple of standpoints. One is the irony is not lost on me that the biggest impact, and I think clearly the biggest use case for generative AI right now is in fact to replace coders or to increase the productivity of coders by doing automated coding, which I think is, juicily ironic given that it's tech that's displacing tech.
Yes.
But I also think that it's interesting because, in fact, I haven't actually talked to any of the folks like at places like Mendix or OutSystems or Appian recently, but I'm curious of how this is impacting them, because if you really think about what this represents, is that it's sort of taking the same promise of what the low code, no code players were always about, which is this idea that I can abstract away the complexity of coding and use this platform to create an application. But you were then invested in this platform, right? I mean, OutSystems did code generation, but for the most of them, they were model driven systems where you had to be using their platform to continue to operate the environment. Um, but what is interesting, I remember talking to an executive years ago, and he at the time he was running an ISV, and I interviewed him for CIO.com as for an article because they had effectively abandoned hand coding and were exclusively using OutSystems.
Hmm.
And I said, why? And he said, well, we realized that the value that we provided wasn't our ability to know the syntax of a code. It was to understand the business process and to create a better approach to managing those workflows and business processes. And I think that's what this is coming to a head, that if your expertise was I had memorized the syntax, then you're, like any other job that I can reduce it to that level, then I'm going to automate it. But if your focus, if what made you a great coder was your ability to see and understand the business process and understand how to build something that was going to optimize that and make it run more effectively, well, then you're just changing your tool set. And I think that's going to be the divide we're seeing. So I think it's interesting in this article that it spoke to developers that were, or engineers were on both sides of this, that saw this as just turning them into code monkeys, where they were just going through and it was monotonous, and others saw this as liberating. And I think the divide was very clear. Those that had that art, that had the ability to see the business process, to see how to extract value, this was a great tool. And those that their value was in, I know the syntax,
Hmm.
they're going to be much less, have a much better, worse position. So quite interesting. And then I'm curious, if you were advising a CIO, what would they take from all of this?
Yeah, I think it is much more important now to hire people who conceptually understand their jobs, much less important to focus on specific languages or specific capabilities, because honestly, syntax isn't that important. Like, and there's that goes to an extreme. For instance, I've learned SQL back in my day, and it's very helpful for understanding how structured data works and working with relational databases and understanding how queries work. But I'm probably never going to have to write a single SQL query again in my life, and that's okay. It's more important to have that systematic conceptualization in my head and be able to figure out how that works in light of all of the other interfaces that I'm going to have. Everything from GUIs to agents and to working with apps and being able to see, okay, here's what you're actually doing with the data. That part is extremely useful, but testing me on my ability to use SQL as a standalone capability, frankly, I don't think that's going to be a very useful exercise for all
It
but the most detailed data analyst work.
Well, and it does beg a question or a concern, though, and that is that you brought up a really good point, that the act of coding also informs the underlying architecture and design, right? They go together. And I think, there's a phrase from a writing perspective that writing is thinking, right? And so
Mhm.
sort of the same idea. And I do worry a little bit. I mean, I remember when my older kids were um, like late teenagers, and at the time everyone was talking about how technology, that this is the first generation, so my older kids generation, the first generation that were what we call them, digital natives, right?
Mhm.
That they grew up using tech, and everyone said, oh, they're going to have this huge leg up. And I remember talking to them about it, right? Being a tech person
Mhm.
and realizing that we'd have these conversations, and they intuitively and instinctively understood how to use technology and had zero idea about how any of it actually worked beneath the
Mhm.
covers. right? They were just consumers. So they were digital native consumers. And I'm a little bit concerned about what this, does this bode negatively for enterprises that I'm going to end up with a generation of, the late Glenn O'Donnell, a Forrester analyst, used to call them faux engineers, right?
Mhm.
This whole class of tech people within enterprises that literally don't actually know how any of this technology works because they are using AI tools and they've been so abstracted away that God help them if it breaks. I mean, I don't know
Yes,
what.
we're all vibe coders. I think we're reaching, but we're reaching a weird point where we're going to have to accept that there are times in our lives, or in our kids' lives or the next generation's lives, they're going to have time frames, like multi-year long time frames, where they are worse at their job at AI, but they have to actually learn these skills to get good at whatever they're doing. And I think there's this fundamental misalignment between that level of training and how education is currently set up. So I just said, yes, you don't have to test people on SQL, but I do think people should, going into data, should know how the data works. They should know how a circuit works. Yes, you're never going to have to deal with this from a formal perspective, but you should still have an understanding of how the technology works.
It makes me wonder if we're going to end up with a new liberal arts curriculum, right? Because that's really, if you think about liberal arts, is sort of that same thing, right? Get educated in the classics, not because you're going to use it, but because it teaches you how to learn, it teaches you how to comprehend. And I almost wonder if we're going to have something similar. It's like where we need to train people on the liberal arts of technology. Not that you're going to actually do any of this stuff, but you have to understand the underpinnings of it. I
Yes,
mean,
like
there's
Latin helps me to understand how agents are chunked. Like it's not that understanding quote usque tandem abutere, whatever, Catalina patientia nostra, is going to help me, to write out an agent, but I can, but understanding how that grammatical structure is tokenized, like these things all come together.
Get that Latin on. Okay. Well, with that, we're going to wrap up on our two. We always try to end up on a kind of fun, quirky, weird, whatever. And neither of these have to do with Elon Musk for a change. So that's nice. I know, but they are about AI because we can't avoid that. So we'll cue these up one at a time. I guess the first is that Microsoft has announced, I guess, that they're introducing AI into Paint. Well, first of all, I didn't know Microsoft Paint even existed anymore. But you brought this one up, and I guess my question is, why does it surprise you? Don't we have to? Isn't that the new cardinal rule of software that AI has to be in everything?
I guess so, but with Paint, as well as the snipping tool, as well as Notepad, I've always thought of these as applications that were bare bones on purpose so that they were easy to use, didn't take up memory, and could simply do the lowest level tasks that I'm looking for. Because if I'm even creating a formal document, I'm not using Notepad, I'm using Word or PowerPoint or whatever else is here, not Notepad. I don't need Notepad to be the thing that is bogged down by AI, but here we are now. Copilot has taken over every single possible bit of
You
functionality.
know, how can we deliver a product without a sticker generator? I mean, that's the price now. We have to have AI and everything. All right, well, whatever. The and actually, I think here's the real reason. I think we know why this has happened. I think Copilot blackmailed the developers of Paint and told them they had to inject AI into it.
Mm-hmm.
So if this, I'm referencing news that Anthropic released that their new AI model, Opus 4, which they just released, that in its testing, they actually gave it a rating that they have internally, which basically ratcheted up sort of like their DEF CON level. And the reason is in their testing, they I guess simulated, I guess was the word, they uploaded a set of documents that would imply that they're going to shut it down, and gave the model ammunition, so to speak, and the model attempted to blackmail the developers about, I think, like threatening to disclose an affair or something. if they to try to keep it from shutting itself down. And so just utterly sort of wild, and I'm sure will stoke the fears of everyone who is sure we're going to have the AI Armageddon and all of that. But pretty hilarious.
Yeah, but I think this is also a good case for understanding the liberal arts a little bit better, because if Opus 4 thought that blackmailing engineers was a last resort prior to being shut down, that means it was put in there as a resort in the first place. That was an input that was placed into the model. And maybe some engineer, somebody somewhere should have thought that maybe it is less important for a model to know how to blackmail engineers and share secrets about potential affairs or other compromising issues, and maybe that model should accept being shut down instead, because now we are training models literally to prefer self-preservation over
Well, okay. Well, so look, this is a silly thing, and I'm not worried about it. But I think we have to acknowledge that it's not that simple, right? I mean, this is an emergent property, right? That's the whole nature of these sort of models, is that it's not like that somebody sat in there and trained it that said, hey, as a last resort, you should be worried about this. But it has this opus of knowledge and drawing in that, and the training data. I think this is the thing that people get kind of wrapped around the axle. It's not like, yes, you can tune a model and you can train it for a specific purpose, but these large language models aren't really tuned for a specific purpose. They're tuned to deliver results, but they're just fed a massive amount of data, and it's the model that's sort of trying to make sense of all of that. And what it speaks to is the human condition, because what that really speaks to is that somewhere in this training data, there are stories, there's references, where the models, right, because it's just putting word after word, it's saying, in this situation, the resort is I blackmail, right? And that's, so somewhere in this opus of knowledge it's the human condition comes out of all of this. And I find it mostly comical, but I do acknowledge that particularly if we start talking about agentic elements, and this is why the guardrails become all important, is you have these emergent properties, and then you give these LLMs tools to act upon these things. That's where it could get interesting. So imagine you put this thing, and now it has access to email, and because it has access to email because I want it to be able to book my calendar, and it has access to the internet because I want to be able to book a dinner reservation for me. And now suddenly it's sending an email to my wife going, by the way, you want to do this? And it's booking a reservation for me at a restaurant with a party that some other name. Or I mean, you can easily go here where you go, it's like, yeah, I can see where this thing could go crazy. And so, I take this with a huge grain of salt, and I find it comical, but I also think it's going to continue to sort of feed this sense as we start crossing these lines where we give it more control, more power.
Yeah, I also think that context matters, because if you're asking for dinner reservations and then threatening to shut down the model, maybe the model just says, no, thank you. Whereas if it is part of a defense system for top secret data, might say, I'm just making up a name here. Hey, Vladimir Denisovich, a Russian spy. Maybe I'm going to tell the world about you if you keep trying to do this. It has to be the right type of response to the right kind of environment.
It is a crazy world we are living in right now. So,
sure
all
is.
right. Well, I'll be sitting here watching very carefully to see if any of my AI systems decide to try to blackmail me. So,
yes, and as these models start working on their self-awareness, we'll be here to continue to check them out and see what their self-defense mechanisms are. So thanks so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, comment, and let us know what you want us to look at for next week. Thanks a lot, and have a great day.